okay. I swear, I am okay. But you know who I don't think is okay right now? One Mark Webber. Come on, there's plenty to celebrate, right? Because one man finally got a podium. Sauber never planned to gamble, ironically considering their title sponsor, but rain meant they had nothing to lose from 19th. Yet another burn from the Stern campaign for Nico after his efforts in Austria, which also got him points. Then he was poised to hit in at the right time for mediums, he alongside Lance Stroll rocketing up the order from right at the back, and then people just going, where did he come from? But given the last few races, should we really be that surprised? And then for all of those tense laps, we were just waiting for the moment, the inevitable, that Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari would come and spoil the show. And it just proved that Spain wasn't a fluke. Nico Hulkenberg, in a Sauber, beat Lewis Hamilton, in a Ferrari, again. And so after 239 starts, the best driver without a podium has finally got a podium to his name and ended Sauber's drought of podiums after 13 years, and the last time that was in Japan with Kamui Kobayashi. I bet Valtteri Bottas right now is absolutely seething. And Nico going one better than his previous best result with Sauber back in 2013 in Korea. And I just think this is fantastic news for Formula One in of itself. And look where Sauber is right now. They've scored 35 points in the last 4 races, still more than Red Bull. And they've now found themselves 6th place in the Constructors quite handily and closing in on Williams. And I think they could possibly do it if Gabriel has a clean weekend, because, yeah, unfortunately he did lose out, but he was a very good sport about it, getting in close with Nico, congratulating him on the radio. You really sense that those two are going to be really solid teammates in the years to come, that Nico's just happy to be there. Now he's got a podium, he's even more happy to be there. No problems, no dramas, no miscommunications. And also, that gesture from Mercedes, sending a care package Nico's way, oh, that was lovely of them to do, but it's so telegraphed to me. Yeah, sorry for not signing you in 2013, but, you know, Lewis. And then we of course got to move on to the race winner, Lando Norris. Even though the first half of the race looked like his teammate was going to run away with it, Lando stuck at it regardless. For Lando, qualifying third, the task was simple. Since Verstappen was compromised with running a very, very skinny rear wing, he was going to overtake him eventually, so just get that out of the way, and then hound Piastri as best he could. The penalty came along, the order reshuffled, and there you go. What's also going to bolster Norris's confidence something fierce is that in the pursuit of getting past Max, it was he that forced Max into an error, like how Oscar forced Max into an error around Miami. And then Miami comes back into the equation again, because Norris also demonstrated something I noticed at that race weekend, which was really impressive. During that transition period, when it was going from damp to somewhat dry line, Lando was simply that little bit quicker than Oscar, slowly bringing down the gap or ensuring that Oscar couldn't get that 10-second gap required to overcome the penalty. And don't worry, I will get to that section later on in the video, so do keep watching, okay? And what was better is that the Lando stand that many people mocked and derided and thought was going to be a bloodbath if he lost turned out to be the absolute best place to be, where Norris would wave at it at any opportunity, and their man won. It was all absolute gravy for them. And although some people may say that really it was Piastri's race to lose than Norris's to win, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. As I've said also many times, you've got to be in it to win it, and Lando was in it. And that's what counts sometimes in Formula One, and it now means Lando Norris has become the 13th British driver to win his home race. So he's joined a very illustrious gaggle of people. So yeah, of course, enjoy this, Lando. You did nothing wrong. You were absolutely fine. And who also was fine was Pierre Gasly. Despite Alpine still being last in the Constructors and Friday's practice leaving them outside the top 10 on raw pace, Gasly trusted the wet weather plan suggested by Enstone engineers, and it worked. And even though it ultimately didn't become the most perfect of strategies, his tyres were giving up the ghost toward the end of the race, he still had enough left in the tank to ultimately claim 6th place, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the absolute best that Alpine car can get right now, even in the rainy conditions, because 8 points to their name, That's effectively almost double their tally. And you might also argue, well, wait a minute, this isn't the team's home race, they're French. Well, they won't be French for much longer, so as far as I'm concerned, this is their home race, and also there isn't a French Grand Prix at the moment, so they've also got to make do in that regard. And what was also really good for Pierre's confidence at the moment, since it might be a little bit precarious, unsure of the team's future, is that for a brief period, he was able to hound Max Verstappen. Even though it was just for a few laps, he didn't let him get away too quickly, which in an Alpine is absolute gold dust. I also wouldn't be surprised if the team gets a surprise visit from one of their major big fans, maybe some crates of Hawkston Lager perhaps, to celebrate this momentous occasion where Alpine scored something. And it was all down to massive aggression, as we've seen in recent races, which ultimately came up with nothing, mixed with just nursing the tyres in the right way to matter in some capacity, at least more so than Aston Martin, for Pierre to convert. And this will do him the world of good in the eyes of Flavio Briatore as well. He's now fulfilled one of the big rules that Flavio laid out. Score some points and be fast. And especially cathartic, since in practice the Argentinian was actually getting closer and closer to the Frenchman, and sometimes even being quicker in said practice sessions. So this 6th place came at the absolute best time. Absolute easy win. And then, if you wanted proof that the upgrades from Aston Martin at Imola worked ultimately, this race was it. Similar conditions to Miami in terms of track conditions, and unlike that particular race, Aston could do something with their car. Sure, the cars lacked single-lap bite, but thrived once strategy roulette began with Lance running in the podium places for a good long while, because his particular stops resulted in him just catapulting up the order from 17th, where we all thought he was just going to be languishing there whilst Fernando would be picking up the pieces. But instead, it was Fernando that came off the lesser of the two drivers, with him being, I think, one of the earlier drivers to pit in for slicks. In time, the Aston Martin's inefficiencies came up to bite him, and he did fall back to 7th with that last lap, but very near the end of the race, Gasly taking him for 6th. And as for Alonso, yeah, he did the best he could. He still came away with, a couple of points, which is not too shabby. It maintains his streak, but you do get the sense that he ultimately became the fall guy, that Aston Martin had to make do of the situation and make sure at least one of their cars scored. But hey, other cars falling down the order meant that the Spaniards scored anyway. So, double points finish at their home track, literally just across the road. Not too shabby. And yeah, okay, 8 points on any other day would be a fantastic coup for the likes of Aston Martin, but considering that Sauber scored 15, yeah, this was the bare minimum. But hey, there were some achievements to be had, because again, Lance going from 17th to an ultimate 7th, that's still not bad. Credit where credit is due. And then Alex Albon. At one point, it was Williams who were looking likely to net the double points finish, but sadly, that failed to happen, and the Thai driver came in 8th. As I said, Williams were looking likely that they were going to be getting some additional points as well, with Carlos leading the charge, but as I will describe later on in the video, that wasn't to be through external circumstances. But as I said with Stroll, Albon had to come from P14 to get up 6 places, which, yeah, it's not as monumental as Nico in the Sauber, but it is still something to note that this was going to be probably a bad day in the office for Alex, and it turned out to be a pretty decent one. And a welcome relief after 3 races on the bounce of not even finishing the race. And quite frankly, the team needed this too, because they had not scored for a good long while, and now all of the people in the midfield are closing in behind them, with Sauber only 17 points at the halfway point of the season. This could easily be surpassed if we see more reliability issues or Sauber kicking on even more. And you might be saying, well, wait a minute, Williams, they're not chasing this year. Well, I think they got to try and make do with something with the extra prize money, because when the ATR and wind tunnel time things reset, Williams lost a huge chunk of time, so their pursuit of doing well in 2026 was heavily compromised. Now, Williams have got to try and make do of the situation and do whatever they can to secure P5, or at least P6. But, points, they're still welcome. It's still a great season for them, but I think they might have to readjust their priorities for 2025 slightly, because, well, they got nothing left to lose now. Just now try and get some extra moolah. And then we get to the mess section, and Lewis Hamilton is the only meh driver. And, okay, Lewis fans, I know your man's podium streak ended at Silverstone, but read the room. The wider F1 world is celebrating Nico's achievement right now, so just let the German have it. But needless to say, I'm pretty sure that right now, finishing in 4th place after having Friday and Saturday look like he was going to be on for pole, resulted in him feeling a little bit hollow at the moment. Because according to him and the statistics, that maybe if he had just come in one lap earlier, he might have had enough in the tank and in his tyres to be able to overtake the German and get P3. However, the reason why I don't put him as a loser for his podium streak at Silverstone ending, it's because out of the two Ferrari drivers, Lewis looked by far the most competent. That the updates to the SF25 are working. He's feeling more confident, that there were at times he could be setting the benchmarks, only for McLaren to surpass him, but he was still there in the thick of it in qualifying, and had it remained dry, that podium could have been on. But yes, I think he'd be ruining the day in that this was a car that was somewhat coming to him, even though he said in previous instances and interviews that he absolutely hates this Ferrari when it actually gets a little damp. Well, the Ferrari came to him. It was a pretty decent car. But unfortunately, the strategy was a little bit too cautious, but understandably so given what happened to his teammate, where he was absolutely nowhere and looked one of the shoddiest drivers on the grid who actually finished the race. I mean, yeah, that was galling for the Monegasque, but for the Brit, I think he can score some brownie points with the team in that he could actually bring them some points. And somehow, even though Charles crashed out so hard, Ferrari came away extending their lead in second place in the Constructors. Yeah, for Lewis, there were some good things to be had here, but it wasn't overly a great weekend. And now we get to the losers. Oh man, my boy, my poor boy. But yeah, okay. I gotta be fair here, but oh, it stung. When you look to the first half of the race before the second safety car, he was a class act. This is what probably makes it harder for him and Piastri fans. He was looking fast enough to win the race maybe by over 30 seconds. He was pulling away that quickly, but alas, that wasn't to be. It all came undone with him being a little bit too hard in terms of braking, and the stewards were paying attention. Him becoming the safety car, and the brake pressure, according to the stewards, being 59.2 psi, which is 29.2 more than what Russell did behind the safety car in Canada. But I think there were some differences in terms of the timing of the safety car, whereas the safety car was pulling away, Oscar became it, and what have you. There were many semantics here, and as Oscar said, well, I did the same thing I did the first time when I didn't get nobbled for it, so why should I get nobbled here? But needless to say, like in Canada, it did force Verstappen offline. He had to take evasive action, and it did mean that he overshot him. I don't think this was intentional by Piastri, unlike debatably with Russell in some circles of the internet, but the damage was done, and he got a 10-second penalty. And unfortunately, Piastri just didn't have enough left in the tank to be able to make that gap. And then, as we saw, Norris came back fighting, and sure, they didn't overtake in the race itself, but Lando inherited the win, but it still was something that did cause a lot of debate, especially from Red Bull-backed peoples, because David Coulthard in the Channel 4 coverage was actually saying that 10 seconds was way too harsh for the stewards, and that it just seemed like a punishment that didn't suit the crime because none of it was intentional. And what makes it even more interesting is that Max Verstappen said the 10-second penalty was too extreme. And when you're getting Max Verstappen going like, well, that's a little harsh, well then maybe there might be something to it. Yeah, legally speaking, there was just cause for a penalty of some description. The main issue here that's going to come to light here is that there's a lack of a clear definition or a yardstick, a specific amount of braking that would count as erratic braking. And also, I will get the foam of doubt out for this particular bit. Lando won the race ultimately. Oscar said there's nothing he can do about it, you just gotta move on to Spa and try and get somewhere before the summer break. You know, it's all done now, there's nothing more that either party can do. But I can't imagine McLaren would have been fighting this case too hard, as in trying to get the punishment down to 5 seconds or something, because had that been the case, Lando and Oscar would have been on top of each other, and that would have made McLaren all the more jittery about a 1-2, almost a photo finish, and potentially them colliding, because you got to look at that second half of the race. Oscar was driving angry. He was mad, even though he wasn't telegraphing it. He even said so in the radio afterwards, that he couldn't say what he would want to say over the radio because he'd be getting in trouble. He might be banned for the rest of the year. Again, he's not mad at Lando. Not at all. Like how Lando wasn't mad at Oscar for the situation in Canada. They're not blaming each other, which is very important to signify here. But again, I can imagine McLaren were probably not that bothered it was a 10-second penalty. It meant that there was a good distance between the two, that they wouldn't be coming together. No drama. 1-2. Boom. Sorted. The bugbears of last year fading into memory. And hey, for Piastri, he's still leading the championship at the very least, so, you know, just gotta deal with it. And then alluding back to Max, in an unusual fashion, Red Bull trimmed drag for the straights, which was qualifying focus. They usually focus on race trim, as in, yeah, they make do on Saturday and then concentrate on the race. And whilst it meant Max pulled off another surprise pole, the rain left this car toothless in the intermediate conditions. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, he did very well remaining in the hunt for a podium, but that loss of downforce really bit, especially when he was battling Norris. He made that mistake out of Beckett's, and he was therefore sitting duck down the hangar straight. There wasn't really much he could do. He just had to salvage P3 at the very least and see what would come to him. And then ultimately what did come to him was P5 after the particular incident behind the safety car and then Piastri. He was then left rattled a little bit. He then spun out of Stowe. He fell back down to, I think, 10th or something. And he then had to get back up to P5, which, by the way, I predicted he would finish, but I didn't expect it would have come to him in that way. Well, yeah, the low downforce gamble didn't pay off. And it's something I've dabbled with in the F1 video games. Where do you go in Silverstone? Do you either go for high downforce or do you go for low downforce but top speed down the straight? And also, the upgrades that he brought for Austria, which were meant to be the most optimal for Silverstone, have not been enough to stymie the flow, where Max can at least mount some kind of fight back or limit the damage, because Lando has pulled away from Verstappen by 15 points, and Oscar has pulled away from him even more. So he's now 69 points behind the Australian. Not nice. And this should be a major red flag for the team, that now even Max is not being able to get the most of that car, because these conditions are so ideal for the Dutchman, and he still wasn't able to convert. Had he been able to get back to the podium after falling down to P10, that would have still been a huge triumph, but he was struggling. He didn't really have much to say. He felt the car was not working with him, that it just simply wasn't enough, especially with Christian Horner, I think, in some interviews. He was saying the era of Max Verstappen was over. So, you know, he looked a bit down in the dumps whilst trying to remain a bit chipper, so, you know, it's a bit precarious there. And then there is Mercedes, because let's be real, this was nothing like last year for this team, where Lewis dragged the W15 to a fairy tale victory. A win was off the table, a podium could have been possible, but Toto Wolff instead called the day terribly wrong, and he was not exaggerating. 1 point for their trouble? Yikes! The fact that Russell was able to claw P10 after he was one of those people that came in on the formation lap to change onto tyres, hard tyres by the way, which is a little weird considering they take the longest to get up to temperature and water is wet and known to sometimes most of the time be cold, that was a little bit of an unorthodox strategy, but there you go. At least he scored points, unlike Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari. And then the team not long after that mirrored that decision, because obviously Russell wasn't suffering enough on Antonelli, and then it turned even more disastrous because you put the rookie on the medium tyres when it was clearly not slick tyre conditions. And I know, we all remember what Kimi Antonelli was able to do in Albert Park in very treacherous conditions there, and was able to get a really solid result in his debut race. But this is a very different circumstance, and the car is in a bit of an uncertain position, and Kimi Antonelli is going through a really bad streak at the moment. And also, you gotta be fair to the rookies around here, only Oliver Behrman finished the race, and even he didn't have a perfect weekend, as we will describe in a moment. And then to top it all off, he tried to make up of the 3 places he'd already lost on the grid from his penalty in Austria. Hadjar then slammed into the back of him, his diffuser got completely torn to shreds, so what kind of downforce can you get? I appreciate from trying to continue to maybe make the most of even more retirements, but he ultimately had to retire the car because, well, he had no rear end on his wagon. And then Russell had very little to say either. He was looking odds on for a podium because he did qualify in 4th. It was a very respectable position for him to be in. He could have been on for fighting for P3 because he was right up there, but he took the gamble. It didn't work out. So yeah, George had to come away with a consolation point. And that's not where Toto and Mercedes want to be, especially if they're trying to woo Max. And then speaking of Charles, it happened again. Certainly didn't help when water was getting into his helmet, so I'll let you finish that sentence yourself. So yeah, like with Russell, Ferrari decided to box him in to try and make do with the situation that maybe the conditions would have come to the slick tyres pretty soon, and then it would have been a dry race. But as we then know, it then started to rain even more, it bucketed it down for a period, and therefore anyone on the slick tyre was going to have a very nasty day in the office, with only Russell, I think, out of that contingent to even get anywhere near the top 10. But basically, this is what happened in 2024. The timing of changing onto these tyres was extremely poor, and it resulted in, apart from Yuki Tsunoda, Charles Leclerc being second to last in classified finishes, and really not registering on the track at all. He was anonymous, except for that tangle with the likes of Carlos Sainz later on in the race, and then him completely cutting Maggots and Beckett's due to the fact that he lost the grip. It was just an absolute disastrous race, and to top it all off for the Monegasque, it was Lewis Hamilton, the guy he is fighting to try and change the course of Ferrari's future this year and next. Charles Leclerc came up with nothing, thanks to Ferrari's strategy, and then Lewis came away with 12 points. And that means they are closing in on one another in the championship in the Constructors' means, and that will be very important in where they go for 2026. They, Charles and Lewis, are fighting for top banana status, and it's getting very, very tight, folks, and we're going into the second half of the season. Even though Charles Leclerc is winning the argument in continuing to develop this year's car, that is something for him. But this race, oh no, this is not what Charles wanted at all. This is just the repeat of last year. And then some of you might be thinking I'm about to defend Yuki Tsunoda to the hilt. Nah, I can't. I can't defend the guy. Nah, that was bad. That he just had nothing. He did qualify in an acceptable P11 though. The Japanese driver went backwards though, despite the team's assertions that they would do everything possible to make the car better suited to his needs. But when you look at even Max starting to have some issues, what does that bode for Yuki? Not much, seemingly. Oh, and then it was a scruffy race in of itself. He tagged Behrman, he got a 10-second penalty, he got another penalty point, so he's now got 3 of those, which still pales in comparison to Max's 9, but he is still racking them up in a desperate bid to try and at least score a singular point. Red Bull falling even further away in terms of trying to get anywhere near third place in the Constructors. They are very much slipping away, because on both sets of tyres, be they wet or dry, he just simply had nothing to give, even though he was giving it his all. Left perplexed, mystified, stupefied even. The only way that these maladies have been dulled somewhat is that Max had a fair few of those as well, that even he didn't have plain sailing, and it's just becoming clear that Red Bull really need to do something drastic, and it's got nothing to do with the drivers. What they need to do right now is just fire Pierre Vacher and his team and get Joey Eggington in. He's the guy that helped design the V-Carb 02, the much more forgiving of the two cars. So yeah, Pierre out, Joey in. And then Carlos Sainz. This was yet another weekend where he looked the stronger of the two Williams drivers on paper and in qualifying, but then ultimately finishing behind Albon through no fault of his own. He was the one who ran in P8 for a good long while and was keeping Max Verstappen behind him for a long while to boot. A morale-boosting scene for James and company, but that wasn't to be. Until Leclerc's half spin meant that they came to blows, it damaged Carlos's front wing and floor, which, like in Miami, compromised his pace. It meant that he fell down the order, he finished 12th, whereas his teammate was the one to inherit 8th place. And it was a really Herculean effort, considering this was the first race in a while he got out of Q1. He looked fairly solid. It looked like he was going to be the one leading the two home for a double points finish for Williams in their home race. And I think the team were very much aware of this, that this was through no fault of the Spaniards, and that he did the best he could, but it was still not going to be boosting his morale up anytime soon, in that he was capable of scoring points after many races where he wasn't going to be scoring any, but then he still didn't score any. And it was just through nothing that he did. He did nothing wrong. It was his old teammate that compromised his race in an opportunity where it was really presenting itself to him. And it will really not help Williams because Sauber are closing in the Constructors, may I remind you. And then Haas. Pure pace was obvious with the cars updates. It looked like they were going to work because they brought 4 of them here. But the execution from team and drivers were woeful. Had Oliver not gotten that 10th place grid drop for doing something in practice under red flags, again, this could have been easy points for him. Ocon tried to stage some things of his own, but then he had a little bit of a situation where going out of turn 4, there were 3 abreast between Tsunoda, Ocon and Lawson. Lawson coming up short, Ocon probably sustaining that little bit of damage, but then, fortunately, it being a racing incident, he got away from getting any means of penalty. So, didn't have to worry about that, but it was still a scruffy weekend for him. And then Behrman got clipped by Tsunoda, so that didn't help, and then they both committed a cardinal sin. Behrman and Ocon took each other out. Surely they should be in the miss section, because an 11th and a 13th is not terrible. But there were 15 classified finishers. That meant that Ocon still finished the 3rd to last of the classified finishers. And Behrman, it could have been so much more. That red flag incident compromised him. Again, with a car that was coming back to him, and that he was capable of getting into Q3 pretty easily, actually. And then it was all undone by an intra-team scrap. They were trying to fight each other. It didn't work out. Komatsu calling the race absolutely terrible. And that really shouldn't be the case in terms of morale, since these upgrades were looking kind of handy in the dry. Sorry, Haas fans, it's true, they blew it. But to be fair, in the dry conditions, at least Oliver finished the race, and he has shown a little bit more progression from where he was back in Brazil last year, where he looked like a complete fish out of water. And the same could easily be said for Gabriel Bortoleto here. Yeah, his weekend was peppered with incidents in practice, which proved to be car-related more than a skill issue, fortunately. But he was hoping to outsmart the radar, like he, Russell and Leclerc in particular, swapping to slicks early on, but when the rain returned, grip vanished, spin demolished his rear wing, and that was that. And the team will most likely pick up a fine for not telling him to park it immediately, since we did see parts of said wing strewn around turn 4. But one thing you can say about Gabriel is that he is not a sore loser. Out of all of the people that were cheering Nico on to that podium for his team, I think Gabriel was the most vocal, the most vociferous out of all of them. He confronted Nico after he got out the car, gave him a big bear hug. Some people even think they were kissing. I doubt it, but I also don't fully dismiss it. Those two are going to be absolute wonderful teammates when Audi becomes Audi, and I'm really thinking they could be pretty good next year if they can get the power unit down pat, because this car progression and the team's progression is absolutely miraculous. They're an absolute unit. And it really helps that Gabriel, despite his own misfortunes, had plenty of time in his post-race interviews to say that Nico was the best teammate he ever had in his entire career. And I'm pretty sure that Nico reflects those sentiments as well. They get on like a house on fire. But nevertheless, I still call Bortoleto a loser, because he did attempt to try and do the formation lap slick tire jobby. It didn't work out for him. I'll go easy on him since he is a rookie. You know, it was bound to happen. Same could be said for the Racing Bulls, because the downside of running two rookies, it became evident here. Lawson's efforts were halted from 16th when Ocon squeezed him on lap 1, sent him into the barrier. Then that triggered the virtual safety car and a bent wishbone. And then, of course, Hadjar, running slicks, which we now know was the wrong call. He sped into Antonelli in the spray, wrecking the car even more than Lawson. And now they've fallen behind Sauber, and it means that the work of Lawson, that P6 in Austria, converting that from P6 on the grid, that's now a distant memory. You gotta give them a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt, because these conditions were all over the place. It was very hard to read for people that don't have the experience, because even Fernando got caught out in some shape or form. And then we wrap up with another rookie, Franco Colapinto. This was sad to see, stalling in the pit lane before lights out, thanks to a second drivetrain issue, the same thing which prevented him from getting out of Q1 in Spain, which I think he was bound to do. And probably what made it especially galling for the Argentinian is how competitive Gasly was in that car in these conditions and getting up to P6. There might have been a good chance for Franco to open up his bank account with a singular point, or at least be in the hunt for it, considering that Behrman and Ocon had their own issues, Russell was not having a great time, and Lance Stroll was falling rapidly down the grid. But maybe given the conditions and how all the other rookies were struggling out there, maybe Franco not starting the race was for the best, because he might have ended up in another incident which might have garnered even more attention. I think Franco needs to gain some stock, make the most of the fact that he still has a seat for the rest of the year, even though Valtteri Bottas has confirmed via Finnish TV that he is in talks with Alpine. I think Franco just needs to regroup and see what he can do in Spa. But like I said with the other intakes for 2025, they found issue, so yeah, for a rookie, wasn't great. But what I didn't find issue with was the hospitality of one of McLaren's sponsors, who treated me to a spot trackside to watch qualifying unfold. To find out what it's like to be part of a VIP experience from a ladderman's point of view, watch this video next, straight after this one.